Matthew, how are you, my friend? What a treat to see you this week. How are you doing?
It's great to see you too. Thank you for asking.
Well,
I am well. I have an idea of where we could go, but before I say a word, I would like to hear the sentences that have given you both pause and momentum this last 5 weeks or so.
Oh, beautiful. Well, I'm thrilled to have a chance to speak with you. It's like sleeting and snowing outside, so the kids were sleighing, and Paul is doing well, so the kids are good. He is officially 10 days old, which blows my mind. Um, the things that have been a line that I've been thinking about a lot, a few things is geometry is discovered, algebra is created, which goes to a theme of many of our discussions. How actually on that question, is math created or discovered? I think geometry is discovered and algebra is created. And the problem is when we describe math, it's too general. There are parts of math that are discovered and there are parts of math that are created. And then of course, if you're saying geometry, then you're talking things like phenomenology, patterns, all of those different things. I've also been thinking about the the notion that when humans are looking for freedom, Michelle and I had a talk comparing nesting and hoarding because Michelle was nesting before Paul showed up. And how really the state of nesting is this supreme freedom. You can just discern, I don't need this, I need this. And you're kind of free from calculation, and yet it's not random. And it's this really interesting thing where I think a lot of times when people talk about meaning or freedom, they're looking for a state like nesting. And I find very interesting too, I always find hoarding fascinating because for me, hoarding is where you end up in autonomous rationality because you always might need something. And so you can always find reason to keep it. And how hoarding is actually very rational. And it shows you how you become a slave of hoarding. And really, the address of hoarding is nesting. And nesting is also making a home. So there's something about hoarding that's very rational, I've been thinking about. Also, I had this interesting thought, and then I'd love to hear the sentences you've been thinking about on how when Eve encountered the snake and the snake could talk, is there a part where Eve went, oh my gosh, Adam might not need me now? He's got a helper here who can talk, and I better eat from this apple to make sure if the snake could eat this apple and be able to talk and be a helper, well, I better get a one up on the snake or I might be replaced. So I was wondering, I was thinking a bit about Eve encountering the snake as a threat of replacement. Not merely you'll be like God in a sort of pride way, but also a kind of, oh, if the animals can talk, they can replace me. This snake could replace me, and I need to make sure that doesn't occur. So that thought had crossed my mind on this idea of, because animals don't talk, and if this animal can talk, it could be a replacement. It could replace us. I think that's interesting because a lot of people do fear being replaced. So in relationships, people will be fake or they'll do something they shouldn't do precisely so they don't get replaced. So those are three areas I've been thinking about: nesting, hoarding, geometry, algebra, and Eve being afraid of being replaced have been thoughts going through my head.
Beautiful. There is snow on the ground here as well. So Midwest, East Coast, we share the frigidity. And discourse is algebra,
Hmm.
as you defined algebra or gave a sense of algebra. And discourse itself is similar to a discus throw. It's a back and forth, um, as you would make as you would sew something, as you would make carpet or a garment, which is I think, a picture too for oral storytelling, because it's what happens next, what happens next, what happens after that other next. And all these NEXTs are mechanical braidings. And that back and forth does everything it can to close up that negative space between.
Right.
But without that negative space between, it wouldn't have a reason to be on either side.
Hmm.
And that discourse lends itself to dialectics, or if you wanted to rise above the mechanical, what happens next, to the what happens next, and start to ride the wave of that and anticipate tensions, irrespective of content, then you might find yourself in the position of Hegel looking at Napoleon on a horse, and that simply being an avatar for where his phenomenology was going anyway.
Mm.
And so it could have just been a cactus inside a pot, and he would have had the same epiphany because it was an anticipation of tension irrespective of the content. Geometry, though, on the other hand, as you said, is something discovered. And ergo, what I would add to that in order to reinforce it is, as a discovered object, it is shot through with rhetoric, because rhetoric is the verbal art of discovering in front of our very ears what was there in plain sight,
Yeah.
right? Rhetoricians take time to catalog, to list, to tell you what they're going to tell you it, and then tell you what they've told you. They're always demarcating with the verbal knife. And that is discovered stasis, or discovered slabs of sonic volume. And because it's on the geometrical side, it doesn't seem to participate easily, if at all, in the dialectics, since the dialectics is something riding the wave irrespective of content beneath the frothy, crusty vertex of that almost crashed wave, right? Good rhetoric never is the almost crashed wave of sound. It's what I'm about to tell you next, and then minus the tension, because they just tell you what they're going to tell you. So there's some comfort in that discovery of rhetoric, and yet in our culture, rhetoric is made such a fortune cookie of dialectical pieces out of. Like, everybody thinks there's a rhetoric for this, a rhetoric for that, and these rhetorics are also fragmentary and siloed, and can we bring them all together? Within all that, I think, especially as people try to talk about ontology, they might find themselves borrowing from the one without looking down at their feet and seeing they're actually at the other. So, for instance, it seems to be in vogue on the internet for people to talk about a hierarchical layout of reality, from bottom up, top down, emergence, emanation.
Yeah.
And they'll take pains to say that the one is not the epiphenomenon of the other. The froth on the wave is as real as the deepest, blackest, pressurized bit of ocean down there inside a vein of rock. But after all that saying, that rhetoric, they then want to go on and make problematic the relationship between those levels of reality, as if they were wanting to go to the surface and break it, either from the top down or from the bottom up, but they feel the weight of their oxygen tank, and they know they only have so much room. And so they have to go up slowly, a little agitated at the fact that it's going this slowly, and it shouldn't have to. And why do I have this oxygen tank? Am I in a place I shouldn't be? Is it all a sort of amusement ride given to me by a post education that has somehow been snuck onto the plate when I thought I had eaten all my broccoli from education? Am I repeating a cycle? Am I just going through another set of someone else's dogma? That's what this oxygen tank seems to be. That's constraining me at the speed I wish to go up and let go of all this dark matter beneath. But then they say to themselves, as they're scratching their heads, slowly going up the ocean, I'm talking to myself like a Gnostic, which also was a word given to me by someone else's rhetoric. So they're feeling this boredom of the slow rise as a postmodern dialectical agitation, irrespective of the content. But as they're reasoning with themselves, they're bringing into play all these bubbles of little rhetorical things they know they could say as they rise. And that doesn't seem to be the full picture, but it's where I find myself, to be quite honest with you, sometimes. So the algebraic and the geometrical, as we slowly rise to whatever is at the top of the hierarchy, and the task being, how do we accept these levels of reality while still granting these levels of reality legs?
Mm.
When you lift the child up, you don't want the legs to disappear, because then when you set the child down, they learn to walk. And then if they walk long enough, they'll grow, and then they'll see you eye to eye. And there's something about that ascension without wanting or acting as if the lower levels, quote unquote, are effervescent and gone. It's almost a more refined way of being a reductionist if one is not careful. The old way of the old way of being a reductionist was to be a materialist, just to say everything up above the ocean is air and we can't see it. So let's go down in a tank to the very bottom in the darkness and see what animal in its gross carapace survives. Well, another way of doing the same thing is, as we rise, see we're getting out of all this muck and darkness and things that don't have eyes. They're so unrefined. It's a reduction upward, even if it's at a slow pace. So those are some things that we can move in any direction with.
I think you're putting your finger on something that's very real and very problematic. And in fact, there is a way in which this kind of reductionism is almost worse, because it seems like it's not. It seems like you're avoiding reductionism, but actually, in the very inability to know how to handle the thought of non-reductionism, it does this thing, like you're saying, it kind of pressurizes you, creates a certain agitation that practically leads to a certain reductionism, because you actually are not modeling your life toward the fullness. The very way to try to grasp it leads to a practical sort of reductionism where basically it's a postmodern agitation. Like it's not a reductionism in which it's not like an ontological reductionism. It's almost a modal reductionism that is ultimately a postmodern agitation. And then the way you deal with that postmodern agitation is just to stay in the language game, or find a new language game, or find a new kind of rhetoric that's entertaining, and you're actually moving. It's almost you're convincing yourself you're not dealing with reductionism because you're moving so much between language games that you're always being, in a sense, titillated to not notice it's a language game. I'll use the language of maps sometimes. You just move between maps continually to make it feel as if it's not reductionism, because it feels like activity. Oh, well, if we're active, it's not reductionist, because we also subconsciously associate reductionism with nihilism, depression, and not moving. There's a subconscious association with reductionism of you're immobile. You're stuck in your room. You don't see the point of doing anything. Well, actually, there's a reductionism in busyness, if you will, or constant activity, that because you associate reductionism with non-action, you don't catch it, or you may not notice it, right? But you're also tracing a very serious problem, which is, it actually, for me, gets into why the body is actually necessary for everything. Because you have to actually almost let your body do the movement of the levels, so that you rise at the rate, not get agitated, and kind of trust the body. Now, I need to put meat on those bones, but a few more things. The dialectic, like you said, can actually just be a problematic rhetoric. In my opinion, when Hegel starts talking about the absolute idea, there's the idea that things are dialectical because there's a higher dimensionality that makes them dialectical. That's kind of like, you know how when you have a planet, there's a gravitational field pulling things, but it's invisible? There's a way in which things are dialectical because there is a kind of, dare I say, hierarchy of being, right? So there are levels, and the reason things pass over into otherness is because there's a kind of force on things in themselves that actually make them pass into otherness. It's not just a kind of arbitrary, oh, take your pick, either or, what does it matter? Not that, that's necessarily wrong, but the problem is if you talk about either or, you also in a sense have to discuss the absolute idea, the speculative reasoning that is of the dimension that makes things have a dialectical motion, that you need to recognize the dialectic to approach that, right? But here's the problem. The brain necessarily thinks dialectically. So if it is your brain that is primary, like if your brain is moving to grasp the upper, it's going to turn the upper into the lower, and you're actually just still in the dialectic per se, right? So because the brain is either stuck in understanding or reasoning, picture thought or reason is more dialectical, which is basically just understanding its own limits, right? Well, if you really understand your own limits, you also understand that you have to somehow acknowledge some dimension that makes things pass over into otherness that you can't really mentally grasp. And yet, don't you need to kind of move toward it? Don't you need to kind of work with it? How exactly do you better align with that dimensionality without just falling back into basically a language game? Because in a real sense, if you don't acknowledge something beyond the dialectic that the dialectic is evidence of, that's the kind of weird thing. It's like an analogy, right? Like it's pointing. The fact that things are dialectical means the very fact that things pass into otherness points to something beyond those things in their stability that makes that passing occur, which of course Hegel strongly associates with time, and then the absolute idea, and then as Godot last, and I agree with, you start getting into things like beauty, the apophatic, Hegel was interested in that, and so on and so forth, right? But then what exactly would it look like to acknowledge all of that and not ultimately just fall into a turntable of various language games to acknowledge that same problem, right? Because that ultimately seems to be all the brain could do, is just acknowledge this tension by different ways. Well, another person I've been reading, and I've enjoyed his book, his name is Greg Dember, and he wrote Hello, Metamodernism. And he's talking about metamodernism in a slightly different way than you often hear. He's talking about it as the aesthetic movement that really started in 2001, that was acknowledging the arts less than things like integral theory or Ken Wilber and stuff like that, right? A lot of metamodern is more in that field, but there's another strain of metamodern that you could say is a continuation of the new sincerity of David Foster Wallace. A lot of people will kind of say that's the beginning of, dare I say, aesthetic metamodernism. But the way Greg Dember in his book, which I highly suggest, I think it's a lovely book, and I like Greg Dember, he talks about metamodernism. He starts off saying it was originally defined as an oscillation between postmodern and modernism, where you have postmodern irony that you start to go, this is incomplete and kind of empty. So you're returning to a modernism that defends rationality, but also you see the problems of rationality, so you're able to swing back in postmodernism when you go too far, but then swing back into modernity when you go too far. And there are things like an oscillation between irony and sincerity, between rationality and emotion, between cynicism and sincerity. And the artist, an example of an artist that is Sufjan Stevens, for example. He uses him as an artist as a metamodern thinker, or a movie like, some of the Wes Anderson films, right? Like the Wes Anderson films have it's a really hard, it's not quite postmodern, but it's clearly going through postmodernity to try, and he'll talk about metacute, there's a kind of childishness, and so on and so forth. The reason I bring this up is because Denver actually introduces a metaphor. Instead of oscillating, he starts saying they're braided together. They're kind of braided. Like the modern and the postmodern are more braided than it is. Like the same scene has both, right? And they become very braided, but they're braided precisely for the defense of an interior space. And this is the key. In a world where I can't be certain of anything, in a world where there's constant cynicism, I can know when I'm feeling an emotion. I may not know if what I'm feeling, if what I think is true, but I do know when I feel sad, or I do know when I feel an emotion. So there's an interior space that you rely on, right? As really the thing that is also, it's real. But metamodernism with a postmodern teaching also knows that that could be emotionalism and fake, right? So you preserve this internal space, but you simultaneously have an awareness that it could be dangerous, right? And yet you're also preserving it because if you lose it, you lose your humanity, right? So you have to kind of preserve it, right? Well, I bring all that up because when we start talking about a hierarchy of being, a lot of people online are kind of also trying to braid it together. Like it's all at all moments braided. And the question becomes, when it's all braided, what is the space that we need to defend that is not lost in that braiding that becomes more pronounced in that braiding? Well, people talk about relationships. People talk about the human, the definely human, this internal space that is defended, right? And there's this idea too that the only way you're going to not just fall into language games is to actually be in relationship, to interact with other people, and to move into community. But then, of course, community can become language games too, right? They themselves can become maps. So then, in the same way that the internal space of metamodernism for preserving the internal emotional experience can ultimately turn into a dangerous emotionalism, you have to see when it's becoming dangerous and then pivot to something else, not to leave behind, say, the philosophical language game, because you eventually have to come back around to that. But there's something else that you have to be able to move into and actually see almost as primary in the navigation between the different hierarchy of being, to use that language, or else it becomes very problematic. For me, this is where I really do think about the body as being primary and thinking about positioning and conditioning the body to actually be what is navigating me through, dare I say, the hierarchy of being. So in a sense, when I am thoughtlessly doing the laundry, I want to think philosophy to get to the place where I can thoughtlessly do the laundry, in a sense. When I say thoughtlessly in a more present state, and actually sort of experience the beauty of it. Because it's almost, for me, the body that is primary in the movement of the hierarchy of being, not thinking. Because thinking, now you need thinking to get your body positioned in the experiences, in the having of children, in the marriage, in the community, to be this kind of vessel carrying the internal space. But thinking, if it becomes primary, is going to drop the higher into the dialectic, and now you've lost the thing that's even causing the dialectic. You've lost the gravitational force, right? So there is something about the body, because the body, like, in another way to put this, if algebra is created and geometry is discovered, there's something where thought is created, but the body is discovered. Like, the body is the discovering entity. It is the discovering entity of the hierarchy of being. And your body also has a way of knowing when you're going too slow in rising, because you were talking about rising. It knows when you're going too slow, when you're going too fast. Your emotions are giving you signals. Hey, you feel overwhelmed? Well, you're going too fast. Hey, you feel bored? Well, you need to go back to those conversations or a relationship. Like I had a conversation with Seth and Aspasia, and then I'll give it back to you. These are just opening thoughts on this extremely important issue. And we were kind of talking about the body as an antenna. Like, the whole body is a kind of antenna. And your brain, your thinking is kind of the wrench to repair the antenna, to tune the antenna. But you can also use the wrench to break the antenna, to start hitting it with the wrench. And that's ultimately often what we start doing. But if you start seeing your entire body being given to you by God to precisely kind of attune this movement in the hierarchy, then that's a different relationship. And I guess this is what I'm saying. The higher, I'll call it the higher level reductionism, just to use that phrase. I don't know if you can avoid the higher level reductionism if you ultimately don't give everything back to the body, per se. Like, you have to give the thinking back to the body, where the body knows, right? Like, the body knows. If you don't do that, you're going to end up in higher level reductionism. And Michelle and I have been talking about this because of just the process of pregnancy. You know, Michelle was talking how when you go into labor, your body is kind of primarily doing the work. And what you want to do is condition your body to let this thing pass through you that is already occurring, right? When actually you make the labor way worse when you try to force it, when you're willing it. And actually, instead, you need to trust the body to deliver the baby. The body is made to deliver the baby. The baby is coming through. And I actually think, and obviously Michelle was also talking about nesting. I think basically there is something extremely, dare I say, feminine in the way that Michelle's describing that is necessary to avoid high order reductionism. There is something about trusting the body, the antenna, letting the body do the work. Now, again, high level, dare I say, philosophy and all of that is really important to know how to condition the body to do the work. So it's not an either or. And actually, the more complicated, globalized, interconnected, higher you get, the more you will need high level thinking. But you need higher level thinking for high level coordination and positioning of the body to let the thing pass through you. Otherwise, well, you just start to feel that all I'm doing is running around in language games, right? Well, the language games, I guess what I want to say now, and then I'll give it to you, is what was that game where there's a color and you put your hand, they spin it, and it's like a board and there's different polka dots. Yeah, you know what I'm saying,
Twister.
right? What is that game? I can't even think. But
I
you
think
put
Twister.
Twister. That's it. That's it. So I think sometimes language games are like, because sometimes calling it a language game can sound derogatory, and I don't necessarily mean that, but I think about them as the little colors on the Twister board. And when the dial hits red, you really need that. You need to know that language game to be able to put your body in that spot so you don't fall, right? So by learning the language games, you know how to position your body so you don't fall, so you're not manipulated, so that you understand what's going on. But the point is for the movement of the whole body, not to do the entire work, right? So it's almost like ideas in language games become little dots in Twister that you move your body to stay up, not to they're not the whole. They're more just like positions that you need to know. You need to know different philosophies. You need to know different languages, to know different ways to position your body, to position your mind, to position your emotions so that you don't fall over, right? Whenever the world throws at you a color or something comes up you're not expecting. And so I've been thinking about that, and I think also this high level reductionism you're describing is very, very serious. And ultimately, to me, it points to some sort of intricate role of the body, and that the body is discovered, not simply created. And it is the antenna of this sort of activity. But let me throw it at you.
So with the body and this higher level reduction that we want to avoid as we ascend, which is to say, grow naturally into more reality and not less, which is a way of saying that we hold more inside, needing less without, having more within. These things could be chapters in the story of the history of philosophy, and all the philosophers that are household names and their schools of thought and their essays could be spun as provincial and stabs at an answer to how to do that. You could make someone as scholastic as Aquinas seem downright pragmatic. You could even say Nietzsche was after the same methodology, if one wanted to. Well, back to the body. One of the schools of thought that erupted, and I would say as a tributary from the Reformation. By the Reformation, the story I would tell is what was being reformed, reshaped, was the human being. So it was transhumanism before transhumanism. I don't mean it derogatory. What I mean to say is, if you would grant me this bit of narrative, before the Reformation, people practiced their commitment to the wisdom of the pace of going up, body, soul, and spirit, that was, for lack of a better term, outsourced to the legacy of their tradition.
Mm.
It made saints. It had a track record of getting people there in different environments. And so it knew what to do with the body. There I am with 20 years under my belt of having a body. The tradition in which I was born, pre-Reformation lights, had multiple generations of experience of dealing with bodies agitated on their way up. So it could deal with my idiosyncratic whelps and whistles and confusions. And so the name of the game would be to process faith by trusting in the earmarks of the tradition. And that would be sturdy enough, indeed had been sturdy enough, for the existential needs of countless generations, with all their ambivalent and vibrant subjectivities.
Mm.
As a result, if someone was going to come by for whatever reason, and if you grant me this in the narrative, and try to segment out and start fresh with some discrete number of individuals, a new emphasis, or the same emphasis with a different direction to it. How would they do that? How? Pragmatically. Well, there would be a deprogramming. How do you deprogram someone from their faith in their tradition that takes care of their body on the way up? I think part of it is you have to put a wedge between what they're orienting their process of faith making in. And one of the wedges they used was a Socratic repetition of tell me how you define X, Y, and Z. Tell me what a turtle is. Tell me what the shell is. Tell me what nature is. Just tell me. I don't have anything up my sleeve. It's safe. I mean, you're an avatar of your tradition. You've told me it's taking care of your body on the way up. You are infiltrated by thousands of years of history of your ancestors, of your cultural conditioning. So it's safe. Just come over here by the campfire. Let's sit down. And I want to ask you a very simple question. What is goodness? What is truth? Who are you? What do you believe in? That, what I'm fascinated with is, why does that destroy someone? It brought onto the scene this hypothetical ideal of certainty that Descartes wrote a chapter for, and the heading was extension, which gave rise to the quantitative supplanting of qualitative fields. Certainty became the hypothetical up that your body could go on its way to, and instead of processing your trust, because you don't know what trust is until you perform trust, and you don't know if you've really performed trust unless you've done a lot of trial and error within a safe space that will gently correct you without discouraging you. that takes time, and it needs to be geared to the same target if it's going to remember itself and recalibrate meaningfully. If it's going to be taken off the path of all that outsourced to the tradition, this hypothetical up of certainty replaces tradition with what? And that I think was a scary move.
Hmm.
And what gave fervor to counter-reformation movements in their frenzy. Because people were losing their minds. People were losing their sense-making apparati because they were slowly, in the course of simply giving up their answers to the light of rational scrutiny, they were finding that this other program offered them certainty now or in the near future. The only thing you had to give up was your faith enduring to the end of your life so that you could wake up at the top in the last judgment, saved by a higher power. And that is what I want to say in our 21st century predicament was a great loss. That scientific quantitative progress could distract us from for a while, but the more and more people found out they could play the game of asking for simple answers, and when they played it on themselves, found that it broke everything in half.
Mm.
You can only do that so many times before you say to yourself, I might waste my life without ever believing in something. And that's worse than being an animal, because an animal is never asked to believe. It's a pure mechanical proposition to be an organism in locomotion, but to be endowed with something that can aspire and to not learn that that is something that has to be learned. It's not something that is in an absence of something otherwise positive. It now truly becomes something belonging to the analogies of investments that grow or stagnate. And with it, our body and what our body contained.
Very well put. Magnificent. There's a thinker, Leslie Newbegin. He wrote a lovely book called Proper Confidence, and he really wants to. And he was a missionary in India, I believe. Is a tremendous thinker, and he really wants to understand modernity as a kind of quest for certainty, or certainty is what defines modernity. And he marks it with Descartes, and he says certainty leads to nihilism ultimately, because ultimately you can't get certainty. But you see, the experience of believing nothing exists feels more certain than saying a given thing exists. So there's a way also where nihilism does a way of feeling like I actually have certainty. And ultimately, I think if your goal is certainty, you ultimately almost get two options. Like you say, you retract to the simplest of thoughts, you atomize, you shrink, or you find really, really elaborate projects that never end, that you can tell yourself that at the end will get certainty, and you just make sure they never stop, right? So you create pitch and risks, conspiracies, giant studies, where you are never forced to lose
index funds.
Yeah, that's right. One day, like you're able, the key is to never lose plausible deniability. And so you design your life to maintain the plausible deniability. So you get certainty either by retracting to the atom, quote unquote, as an individual in an apartment you never leave, or in just not having, like, retract to the simplest, which is by definition reductionist, or set yourself up in a process that cannot end, and therefore there's always plausible deniability that certainty is up ahead. And if you die before you get there, that doesn't disprove the certainty. That just means you died before you got there. Perfect. And so there's a kind of, but this is also why I think modernity, as Leslie Newbegin is putting it, does lead to some of the psychoanalysis, because everyone has to, the games of self-deception, the games of avoidance, disavowal, all those also play perfectly into games of maintaining plausible deniability of certainty, right? Of arranging the board so that you never have to actually encounter the lack of the lost object of certainty. Like you could say the ultimate lost object in a Lacanian sense is certainty for modernity, right? And that has led to all sorts of problems, right? But if you don't have certainty, what do you have, right? You know, what does that leave you with? And I think basically certainty, nihilism, psychosis, pitching, all those different things they're on a straight trajectory. The thing I've also, on what we were saying before about the body, on what we're saying about certainty going mad in the mind, the other thing I've been thinking a lot, and we have discussed it, is the difference between apprehension and calculation. So we have talked about that, but I think that's very important here. The moment you enter, this is the weird thing, the moment you enter into calculation, if you are in that realm, you must at best end up in high order reductionism. Like calculation always leads at best to high level or high order reductionism, as we were describing, right? In order to avoid that, you need to apprehend. You just need to apprehend the whole. But of course, how can you apprehend the whole without calculating the whole that you're apprehending, right? Like, how do you do that, right? I also think it's very interesting. I've been curious more and more in the experience of calculation versus apprehension. Like when I apprehend this moment with the kids is beautiful, one, I don't think this moment with the kids is beautiful. That sentence doesn't enter my head. There's just an apprehension. The apprehension feels energy giving. I feel more energetic with the apprehension. But when I'm calculating, it feels energy draining. It feels entropy. So I've been more and more associating apprehension with negentropy, which is the opposite of entropy, and calculation more with entropy. And actually, my lived experience suggests that. When you apprehend something as beautiful, you feel more energetic. Yet it's a mental activity, and both are activities of knowing. And really, there's a part of me that ultimately thinks, like, we often assume, I have no proof of this, it's just something I've been thinking about, like we often assume the universe will end in entropy, but maybe like it always approaches entropy, but actually if the universe can move toward a mode of apprehension, it actually always gains the negentropy to not, even if it has a trajectory toward a tendency toward calculation and entropy, actually beauty and apprehension kind of curve it, if you will, keep the dance going, right? Because just when you're starting to lose energy and you're about to stop playing music, suddenly you apprehend the next improvisation as you're playing piano and you go another 4 hours. And it's like entropy is disproven in that moment of apprehension, right? There is some sort of mental activity the human is capable of, in my opinion, that gains energy, and it is a kind of knowing that is like the artistic experience that is not energy draining. It is more on the side of negentropy than it is entropy. And in order to avoid high order reductionism, you must be in apprehension. You have to stay in apprehension. And all calculation has to lead back to apprehension and ultimately kind of negate itself as just being that of which is supposed to go back to apprehension, which makes it seem as if calculation wasn't needed at all, right? Now, Hegel warns at the beginning of the Phenomenology of the Spirit correctly that there is a dangerous form of intuition, which is where I just intuit the truth and I don't need philosophy and I don't need books because I just know that, you know, this king is good or something. And he's very concerned about this form of intuition. But then there's on the other side of philosophy and calculation, there's almost some sort of higher intuition, some sort of higher apprehension that is the acknowledgement of beauty as a transcendental that if you stayed on cheap intuition, you would never get to. You would just be intuiting your own personality, basically. but then you leave behind thought. And that's the weird thing about absolute knowing. It's you're leaving behind thought actually at its very limitation, where you then enter into a certain mode of apprehending, where you apprehend things and there's a certain inspirational structure to it. The reason why I also emphasize this is because apprehension seems to be, in order to move into apprehension, you have to preserve that inner space that we were saying before with the metamodern, and your body holds that inner space, and your whole body is what does the apprehension, whereas when you're primarily calculating, you're just using your brain, and you're basically letting your body waste away, right? Like you're basically just letting your body waste, right? But if the whole body thinks, like Seth talks about, like Seth Dillinger, he talks about the whole body thinks, and God gave you the whole body to think, not just the brain, then it's the whole body that apprehends the moment. And like in prayer is more apprehensive than it is calculative. Like if you're just calculating, there seems to be a problem. Ritual is more apprehension than calculation. Beauty is more apprehension, the more deepest moments. But you have to go through calculation to get there. Or, as David Hume puts it, if you don't have calculation, you won't have strategy, basically, and someone will take advantage of you. Someone will come along and take advantage of you. But the very act of calculating then puts at risk ever reaching apprehension. And if you stay in calculating, then you have the little dots, the language games, the little circles for Twister, but you never move your body. All you do is just kind of lay dots, but you never actually play the game, if you will. And the language games are to help you actually move your body rightly, to rightly apprehend the moments that you are present in. Also, I bring that up because if we ask the question, what does it mean to believe in something? There's a weird way in which if you calculate it, do you believe in it or have you concluded it? Like, what's the difference between concluding something or believing something, right? There's a weird way in which you believe that which you apprehend is true, and you can't really put it into calculationable terms, or you can't break it down into algebra. Like, it's a belief is an apprehension. It's almost like beliefs are more on the side of apprehension, whereas the problem is after, dare I say, forms of the Reformation, we associated beliefs with what you've calculated to be true. You have calculated this to be true, therefore you believe in it, right? Well, that's conflating the terms belief and conclusion. You've concluded this is true, right? Which I'm not saying forms of maybe apologetics are bad. I'm not saying that. No more than we're saying philosophy that calculates is bad. But ultimately, it has to move to some sort of apprehension, some sort of grasping. And the reason why I also say this is because that's scary. Like if you apprehend it and you believe it's true, and yet you can't really defend it, or it's hard to explain, or you would have to kind of have the spiritual development to get that apprehension as well. There's a certain having to believe in it because you have to have faith in it because you can't really bring it into fully calculatable terms, right? So what you apprehend brings a certain courage because you apprehend it and you trust in that apprehension and you continue moving and you don't bring it into calculation. Which of course seems, well, you could be apprehending wrong, and that seems to be madness. And what if you like make a big mistake? Yeah, that's why it's belief. Like if there's no possibility of a mistake, is it belief or is it a conclusion, right? And so we really there's something about the whole body being in the position. The whole body has to be in the work of a lifetime to condition itself to be able to apprehend reality, to kind of grasp it in its shine, which you can only do with the preserving of an interior space of which the human is found, which also God is, working with God. Like that space is preserved precisely for relationship with the divine, the transcendental, etc., so forth, that if you do not do, you end up in a high order reductionism, if you will. You end up in a reductionism all while you talk about emergence and hierarchy and immanence and all these different things, right? Because if ultimately all of that doesn't come down, I guess this is what I'm saying, and then I'll give it back to you. If all calculation ultimately must arrive at a high order reductionism, it must, because reality isn't calculated. I guess that's what I'm saying. Nothing around you is calculated into being. It is itself. Calculation is what humans do to figure out what is there in non-calculation. Like if algebra is created and geometry is discovered, then everything you experience was not calculated into being. It was created into being as its whole self, right? So calculation is always a low order experience of what is, right? It has to be. So if you want to get at what is, that is non-reductionist, it's not enough to have the ideas of non-reductionism. You have to have methods and modes of non-reductionism that approach the reality in a non-reductionist way. Well, that's a different method of being. That's an entirely different mode and method. That's not merely information. That's a different mode. And it is a mode of apprehension. It's a mode of apprehending the things. Like people talk about mystical visions. They talk about them as a kind of apprehension, and that's that. There's an apprehension of things. The love that moves the sun and other stars. Well, now explain it to me. Which then seems to be evidence that it's not real, but actually the inability to explain is evidence of its higher form, that you would just have to do it to get it, right? You'd have to enter into the space to understand it. And so there is something about apprehension that becomes the necessary kind of onto-epistemological mode so that you actually are not just going to end up in a high-order reductionism of some kind. So I'll give it back to you, but I've been thinking about that difference between calculation and reductionism as kind of important to think of a new mode to avoid. If you don't have it in a different mode, like a different method, then you're going to end up in high order reductionism. But of course, this then speaks to a very odd kind of mystery, if you will. So if you start in a cheap intuitionism and you need calculation to get out of the cheap intuition, what marks the transition? What is the transition from calculation to apprehension? When does the apprehension arise? What is this mode that seems to arise that we could perhaps better associate with Bergson's intuition? And we've talked about apprehension. Where does it arise? What happens when it arises? Where is it? I mean, it seems to be something the body comes to. It seems to be something that comes, that is a kind of, well, this makes me think of gifts of grace and God's action and things, that the wind comes and goes and different things. There is some sort of mysterious apprehension that is necessary to participate in. I guess we can talk about personal knowledge of Planier, but there's, obviously phenomenology. There is some sort of apprehensive method, complatio, that comes into the picture at some point for some reason, without which high order reductionism seems unavoidable. But those are some thoughts. I'll throw it back to you.
Excellent, my friend. I always appreciate your terms and how you relate them.
Thank you, sir.
The apprehensive. Now, in these last 3 or 4 years, I have gradually disavowed my romanticism. And what I mean by romanticism is a belief in a project of assuming where the world is going to hell in a handbasket is in a handbasket that has its arc around a string that is mechanically being moved down and up like a ski lift of all these goods and services from our world down into the flames. In other words, the problem with our world is it's far too mechanical, industrial, otherworldly, alienated from the human and human concerns. And so to be a good romantic, I need to look at a flower and I need to see it as if for the first time, as Adam saw it in the garden. And I need to humble myself to the point where I am less than a flower and I am a student of the flower. And now I will begin to speak like a baby in metaphors that I'm gleaning from acute observation on the life form and lifespan of this flower. And so my made things in opposition to the industrially made things is a net full of organic metaphors. I no longer believe in that project because images are low-hanging fruit.
Mm.
So some of the ancients said that Adam had no imagination in the garden. Was that a slight? They did not mean it as a slight. He didn't need imagination.
Mm.
A bee needs imagination because what the ancients thought of the image was it's a mechanical thing. It's a wheel, it's a square, it's a triangle. The bee has to have some, and they always thought of an image as a wax and hot metal.
Mm.
That is, whatever carries the sign impresses itself upon something that gives in, receptive of the stable heart sign, so that then when the archetype is sublimated, is lifted, and moves away, an image of where it had been remains without changing the wax, but improving on the wax by multiplying the archetype
Mm.
without doubling the archetype, without giving the archetype's place away. So a bee is full of specific impressions that faintly but repetitively guide its legs and interactions with other bees. And I don't know, I'm not a bee. But it goes that that's how they coordinate their actions. It's similar to a roulette wheel. It's a bunch of little wires next to each other. Now, that is in and of itself a reductive metaphor, but I don't intend it to be. What I want to say is they thought of images as low-hanging fruit, gross product. So the thing about it, and I think this is where the problem of the one and the many stems.
Mm.
So you have the one and the many as an apprehensible problem that demands a solution the moment you perceive something. Because there's no such thing as image. There is an image. If I look at a strawberry, I have lost the game of refinement because I'm stuck with this strawberry. As Hegel began with the phenomenology, it's this tree. And the problem with this tree is it's not that tree. And that tree doesn't tell me anything about this tree, but they're both trees. And I can't find more of the universal tree on the left tree than I can on the right tree. But now that I know there's a right tree and a left tree, I can't forget either while I search for universal tree. And this many forests the one, giving me something to do without any progress in being. Where will I ever find what trees are in a forest full of trees? I'm stuck in this sea of images that constantly make quiet and loud arguments about their own faithfulness to their archetype, but they continue to beg the question. And you can't get enough Socrateses to go out in the forest like someone looking for a body. Right? That scene in the detective movie when you have the townspeople going in line, in file, see if they're going to kick something against the pine cone and find it. You could send out a phalanx, an army of Socrateses out into this forest of images and to shake each one and ask it simple questions. And each one would give up its transparency. But you still wouldn't get the truth, the archetype. Because you're at the low-hanging fruit, which is this hardened, gross, engorged, specific stuff. Now, the Gnostic would say proof of its evil. The Christian would say, no, not evil, good. If I try to use it for everything, then I hurt myself. It's not the image that's hurting me. It's me misusing it. Just like if I choose to take the hammer and hit my thumb 4 times instead of the nail 4 times, it's not the hammer's fault that I'm bleeding and I've broken my bones. So they thought Adam, in his mind, before the fall, had no need of images there. So then the question becomes, what was going on up there? Go fast forward to the Gospel of John. But before we go there, think of the Gospel of Luke, where the Lord says, the kingdom of heaven is not outside you, over there, it's inside. Now, this bears on what we mean by image. So, is a facsimile of the Roman Empire underneath my sternum? Am I supposed to think of the space that God dwells in as an antechamber, as a portico? We have to be careful. If we hang all our goods and services of aspiration on the limb of low-hanging fruit, because then we start to run into these weird duplixities. So then in John, when he's talking to Nicodemus, who says, can a man be born again if he is old? Can he go back into his mother's womb? This low-hanging, gross image of, I don't know how birth can happen twice. I don't even know if it can happen a split second after it happens. The Lord gave him an image of no image, right? The Holy Spirit. You hear the sound of it, but you don't know where it comes from or where it is going. I've heard an ancient say that the Spirit is an image of pure freedom. And one of the reasons, it seems to me, is it's not tied down to the contours of any one dimensioned thing. It's not a strawberry. It's not a freedom. Oh, I'm financially free. Oh, I'm free of that pain in my tooth because I got it ripped out. It's not a positive or a negative freedom because it's not tied down to an image. In other words, it's not tied down to this calculated game. Okay, and my last part to that is, so we have Adam in paradise, in the enclosed garden. And how does God relate to him? You may eat of all these fruits, all these trees, except this one over here. It's the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. You shall not eat from it, for on the day you eat of it, you shall die. When Satan comes along, it says he was more crafty and subtle than all the other animals. So subtle, crafty. If he was the angel of light before he fell, what does it mean that he fell, that he came down, that he now is an animal, that he's this subtle body? Sometimes when we imagine something and we give time to it, we become a version of it.
Yeah.
I'm going to work out today. Well, then you become a little fitter. And it's even more subtle than that in ways that I couldn't begin to articulate or catalog. But then if you are possessed in your mind of having to calculate, you're probably going to see in the middle of every single relationship an equal sign.
Yeah.
And then you have to play this unreal game of being in two places at once. This side of the equation, that side of the equation, and you have to be both places at once so that you can make it equal.
Yeah.
Because to have faith is to be willing to stand on one side, not the other.
Right.
Because on the side of the other is where the other participates in your faith by rewarding it or proving to you that your faith is misplaced. If it's not faith, there's no room for the other because I'm playing both sides. So the evil one had them look at the tree, had Eve look at the tree, and then he gave her little propositions to it. So if you eat, then you'll be like God. And you won't die, because God knows you'll be like God. And I'm waiting for you to say to yourself, oh, yeah, because God can't die, because God is God. God is life. And if I eat that, I'll be like God, and God can't die. So if I eat that, I won't die. The problem with that whole cycle is it was me playing both sides, not participating in faith at all, but making the choice to harden, to crouch down, to solidify. Because real freedom is waiting for the other to be the other that you could not have controlled. It's the surprise factor.
Yeah.
And that's I don't know where it comes from. I don't know where it's going. But you hear the sound of it. You are participating in it. It's in you. It's real. You're responsive to it. Like hearing is such a responsive act. You can be hardly responsive staring at the paint dry. But if you try to listen to paint dry, I mean, it already gives itself away. You're going in, you're trying to listen, you can't hear it. But maybe if you put your ear against it, after you cake your ear, you're going to hear something through the wall. Hearing is this picture of intense responsiveness and activity. It's alertness, vigilance. And for this as an existential option, that this could be a way of life, the present moment could be so alert and alive without having to know where it comes from or where it's going, without having to be God all around oneself. It's hard if we're in the habit of calculating.
Yeah.
And if we're in the habit of calculating, then it just means we need to accept that faith isn't this thing we were taught growing up. Namely, it's just when you shut your brain off. It's a learned relationship. All Adam had to do was shut down the calculation, and he would have been all right. And he could have done it because he would have had something stronger. Oh, wait, God said don't, and I'll just wait. If God wants me to have it later, he'll give it to me later. I'm perfectly content. I'm in paradise. I'm happy. I'm loved. I love him. I have things to do. I have so much freedom inside. I don't need to obsess over this tree. But in calculation, all you're doing is circling within the circle to get to the center of the. And that also is a picture of hardening into an image that can't break out. An image is not an eggshell waiting for the chick to come out. The image is that egg, the egg of porcelain that can never be broken out from or into. Not to say images are evil, but if images are the phenomenological experience of the deadening of faith, layer by layer, then it's a metaphor for death.
Excellent. You said, I really like what you, so when we were talking about apprehended, what's very interesting is that hearing apprehends, hearing does not calculate, smelling apprehends, touch apprehends. The senses actually apprehend. And, many of the empiricists would say, well, thinking is just the arrangement of senses, right? Everything that you know, every thought is just senses, and all thinking does is arrange senses. Well, it's more that for me, thinking is to serve the senses. It is not reducible to the senses, but it has something about being able to condition and posture yourself to apprehend. And there is actually, the whole body thinks, as Seth puts it, there is actually, I think, some sort of, I almost want to say, emergent relation between all the senses that can be worked through. There's almost, some people call it like a sixth sense. I don't know if I want to say that, but some sort of apprehension of things that seems to be the form of thought that things like faith are getting at, or traditions of religion or contemplation or prayer, right? It is Like prayer, if we get into this deep contemplatio prayer, seems to actually be an emergence of all the senses that thinking serves, because thinking has a role. Because the idea that we talk about the five senses is kind of arbitrary. I've heard people say there are like 20 or whatever, right? I'm not, I don't know all of that. But it's funny how we don't include thinking as a sense, right? Like thinking is not a sense, right? We say the senses. Well, there's a way in which thinking is about a sense of things. You're seeking a sense of things, right, to make it sensible. And when you touch things, you're trying to get a sense of them, right? So there is something about thinking that is like the senses in that it's getting a sense of things, but it's all about the order, right? It is all about the order of these things. And it seems as if thinking really is critically trying to condition the senses, right? Whereas what we tend to do is say, well, thinking is just the senses, or we forget about the senses in thinking. And I do personally want to strongly connect thinking and senses, but I almost want to say thinking serves senses versus thinking is just the arrangement of sense data, right? There is some sort of serving. Now, here's what's interesting, though. What you were saying with the problem of the image is really important. Often what thinking does is just create images, at which point it is not serving the senses, it's replacing the senses. And so thinking wants to replace the senses because it's energy efficient and I don't want to be bothered and it has a natural tendency for dominance. But ironically, that becomes entropic because you know how you were saying shrinking? All shrinking is entropic. All this is entropic. The problem is that this moves beyond what you can think. So in order to be neotropic, you have to go beyond the comprehensible, which seems to be entropic because I can't comprehend it, therefore it's nothing, but actually it's a movement in the nigentropic, right? And so that's the weird kind of apathetic thing that occurs, right? But thinking serves the senses, and the senses without thinking get disarranged, or they become full on themselves. You come to overly enjoy the senses, and then you end up in pleasure, or you're a henothist, right? So you need thinking to serve the senses. But then thinking goes along and says, you stupid senses, you can't understand anything without me, and you just end up in pleasure and frivolousness, so I'm better than you. And then rationality is no longer thinking is no longer the handmaiden of the senses per se. It becomes the ruler of the senses, right? And so there's something about thinking that needs to serve the senses. But what it tends to do is fall into imagery, to describe the senses or to understand the senses. This is where the problem of it, I am always struck by how the use of metaphor is always almost mixed metaphor with Jesus. Like metaphor's fullness is found in a mixed metaphor, but you were taught in school that mixed metaphors are bad. Well, mixed metaphor keeps the metaphor from becoming an image. It breaks it up before it's solidified, right? Like good imagination is mixed imagination, where it breaks itself before it gets there, right? The problem is we're taught, no, mixed is bad, mixed is bad. No, there's a weird way in which a mixed metaphor is actually a good metaphor, precisely because it won't solidify. When Jesus is, he's like, like I'm a sheep, you're sheep, I'm a shepherd. Well, what does that mean? He doesn't really tell you. That's the other thing. Like in the Bible, when he gives you imagery, it's often not really explained, or he just sets it up in a parable. And you're like, what does that mean? And you have to think it, right? So there's something also about the problem with a lot of imagination is that we explain the imagination versus let it sit there. And this is the funny thing. When Jesus does a parable and doesn't explain it, it then actually becomes a vehicle of apprehension because you're constantly reapproaching it and apprehending it anew. And then you calculate, but then you come up and say, oh, a new angle. Oh, a new angle. Oh, a new angle. So when you have a parable, because you can almost make distinctions between image, parable, etc., mixed metaphor, it seems critical that when imagination is employed, it is always done so with a mechanism that upsets the very image it puts forth, right? Which is what a good novel definitely does. Like great literature does that. Like it intentionally, just when you're about to say what War and Peace is about, it denies the enclosure and it messes you up with a character who does, like they're too alive to be enclosed, right? So thinking and calculation seem to be needed to serve the senses, to keep the senses from getting lost in their own experiences. But thinking cannot do that well unless it sets up mechanisms that doesn't ever let it enclose on itself, like a mixed metaphor, or an image that it then breaks up. Or it says, wow, that's a really good image of a sunset, and it reminds you, oh, but it's not a sunset. The map is not the territory. Thinking can't serve the senses to condition the senses to move toward this apprehension if it solidifies. And so the mechanisms of thinking have to be such that it doesn't allow solidification. And this is where what you brought up with the romanticism and the equal sign, like imagination has to always make sure it doesn't bring in an equal sign. It has to always avoid the equal sign. And one of the problems with, if you go, flower's good, industrialism bad, all I need to do is become more like a flower, there's an equal sign. Industry equals bad, flower equals good, right? So even though, the more difficult thing, the trick is to go flower good, industry good. What? Oh, well now it's a mixed metaphor. Now it's mixed. But the industry kills the flower, and the flower doesn't want the industry. So what do you mean they're both good? When God says it's all good, this is the problem. If it's all good, it's all mixed. If everything is good, then it's all a mixed metaphor, right? And it's all good, but here's the issue. It is all good in the fullness of reality, and it's quote unquote bad to the degree that it lacks reality, right? But that means the same thing, the same flower under one condition is good and under another condition lacks reality. The same industry has reality and then another doesn't. Well, then it's mixed. Like it's all mixed. So everything is actually better approached by mixed metaphor and mixed imagery than it is by, well, just a kind of straight image, right? An equal sign, right? Because that's where, if it's really a name of the game of, as you were saying at the beginning, does it have the fullness of reality or does it lack reality? Well, then everything is mixed up with the potential for both, right? And mixed metaphors actually keep you from, actually better habituate you for that reality to see things as mixed. And it just depends on your conditioning and your approach to it, right? And I think what ends up happening is we either want to go economy good, GDP good, lack of it bad. They're all secret equal signs. And then we let those equal signs be our imagination. And imagination then serves the reification of the equal sign. Well, the moment imagination is serving the equal sign, well, I no longer need the senses because I have certainty. I know what's good and what's bad. I just need to think about the flower. I already know. Okay, senses, you did your job. When I was young, you made me find a flower. Good, I'm good. Now I just need to think about it and calculate it and reach the equal sign. I need to calculate the flower, right? Well, once imagination brings in the equal sign, once thinking gets the equal sign, it's not going to be the handmaiden of the senses anymore. It's actually going to just be the primary thing, right? And then calculation is the primary thing. And imagination serves calculation, right? As opposed to, I guess I also want to say, imagination seems to be necessary for mixing up, right? Because when I look at a bookshelf, I don't see it passing into otherness. I don't experience all of the dimensions of the bookshelf, right? But I can use imagination to know it's there. But imagination is always supposed to contribute to mixing it up to make it alive versus make it stable. Okay, it's made of, I can imagine the atoms. I know it's atoms. Therefore, that's what it is. I'm done, right? Imagination, it's almost like you need imagination. This is almost what I want to say. Right imagination is needed so that a mixed metaphor is comprehensible to you. Because that's the weird thing. Mixed metaphors are comprehensible. We do apprehend a meaning. And I like mixed metaphors too because they almost have to be apprehended. This is weird. When somebody mixes metaphors, you can't calculate the meaning, but you actually do apprehend it. Well, that's a secret. Mm-hmm. The difference between calculation and apprehension comes out in the mix, in the error, in the break, which we then take as a mistake. We apprehend the meaning and we say, oh, well, that's a mixed metaphor. Let's move it to calculation. No, wait a minute, pause. How did you apprehend the mixed metaphor? How did you do that? Well, because I know what they were trying to say. How do you know what they were trying to say? You could calculate, explain it to me, right? You did it before the explanation, right? So in a mixed metaphor, there's an apprehension that is actually very powerful. Imagination, I think, actually is why you're able to apprehend a mixed metaphor, even though you can't calculate it, right? So you need this capacity of the mixed metaphor to have the apprehension. But the problem is imagination then falls back into thinking and becomes an image. I almost want to say imagination, maybe for Adam, is actually just the pure apprehension. And then perhaps after the fall, it turns into an image-based thinking imagination. And that apprehension, like that imagination, is that faculty of apprehending a mixture, of a dance, of a many in the one, right? Because I guess also, that's also what I'm kind of thinking about. A mixed metaphor is a kind of many in the one, right? Like they don't go together. There's many, and there's yet a one that's apprehended that isn't clean, right? So when there's a mixture and you apprehend it, there's a many in the one, right? And there's something about the faculty of imagination that seems to be, whatever it is, and these things could be elaborated on, that seems to be what is able to actually make us apprehend things that we don't think about. But then we immediately think about them and then bring that apprehensive capacity into image, like a clean image that then solidifies and is no longer breaking up. And I guess I also then associate that kind of apprehension, because there's something to me where apprehension is a kind of sublation of imagination. It entails imagination, but it is not reducible to what we tend to mean by imagination, which is just seeing of images, right? It's some sort of fullness of thoughts that needs the imaginative capacity to do, but is then not reducible to a mere image, right? It's some sort of wholeness. And also do note, when we imagine things, we don't tend to imagine points, we imagine scenes. Like imagination has this kind of worlding. You tend to world when you imagine. Like I always think it's interesting with dreams. You don't dream a thing, you always dream a world. As if a revelation that thought must world. Like thought must world. Like imagination must world. It can't just do a point. It must make a kind of whole, right? And of course, the key to a dream as well is you don't calculate the dream into existence. You don't calculate the different parts of what would make a good dream. It's just there, right? A dream is bam, right there, right? And it's almost like whatever capacity of the mind that is unveiled in dreaming, it's almost like that's what we're supposed to do when we're awake all the time. This kind of apprehending and being of an entire world that is just really hard to do because our awake brain always is getting in the way with calculation, because we want to make sure when we enter into apprehension, we don't do it wrong or we're not taking a big risk. But then that very fear can keep us from it forever, right? Or something like that. And I guess and then I'll give it to you. I also, again, like, there's something very mysterious about apprehension, but we then also just do it all the time. Like when you encounter someone, you can kind of tell if they're upset or if they're in a good mood. You can kind of apprehend the field. You can apprehend emotions. If you're really good at, say, fixing pipes, you can look at a pipe and apprehend pretty quickly if it's good or bad without necessarily going through everything, right? When you read enough novels, there's a way in which you can apprehend if this is a good story or not. We do it all the time, and it is the product of a lot of diligent work, but ultimately what's odd is a supreme evidence of doing a lot of rational work, if you will, or calculation, is the ability to no longer have to calculate. That's what's weird. Like calculation, a testament to the heights of calculation can be when you don't have to do it. You can just apprehend, right? And so there's something weird. Well, if we know, I guess this is what I'm saying. If we know that's the case in like supreme professionalism, why wouldn't it be the case for the supreme professionalism of being a human being, right? Or spiritually, right? Like, why wouldn't that just apply to the fullness of the human, to being able to apprehend primarily versus calculate? And then to me, I guess I also stress that because if the feeling of apprehension can bring with it a certain negentropy, a certain inspiration, a certain kind of like yes-ness to life, well, that's addressing meaning crisis, right? That's actually what you're looking for when you're looking for the ability to move out of nihilism. That feeling, that apprehension is what you're looking for to get out of infinite language games, or like what you are looking for. And that then, I guess I brought up Dimber too, to say that capacity is ultimately what we kind of should be preserving or exercising in this braiding of the postmodern and the modernity. That is what we want to be exercising, which is not merely an emotional experience. It is highly emotional, but it's not emotionalism, but it is a certain apprehending of the world that funny enough, also kind of gives you certainty without certainty. It gives you a certain attraction and confidence. Like you experience the beautiful with, like certainty is not a problem when you're encountering something beautiful. Like no one, when they encounter the beautiful, worries about certainty. It's like that, yeah, that's beautiful. Like you don't even blink. It's only when you're asked to explain it that you doubt it, right? But in the initial apprehension, you're like, yep, that's beautiful. Yep, that's love. Yes, this was wonderful. Well, how do you know? Oh, I don't know. And then you forget, right? Almost the fall is like right there, right? But in that apprehension, the problem of certainty is dealt with quite easily. It's only, in a funny way, thinking about certainty is more of a problem than certainty. It's when you think about certainty that it's a problem, but when you're actually just apprehending, or that certainty is not nearly, it doesn't bother you so much, right? Because it's there, but that is in the power of apprehension. You said many very powerful things as well on both sides, one side, two sides. I guess and then I'll give it to you. And I'm also thinking about description, calculation, apprehension, because a lot of times with the metaphor, if I could just be like a flower, you're actually doing a form of calculation, but it's in description. If I just get the right description, add a description, it is a form of calculation. It just doesn't seem like it is because it's the romantic description, right? Like that can be a problem. But it's also like when you say flowers good, industry bad, it's not that you've taken a side, there's only one side. You don't actually take a side, there's just one side, the flower side, right? In order to take a side, there has to be two sides and you make a choice, right? And that's where it's very difficult. There has to be real risk, right? So you can have playing both sides, which is very bad. Then there's I'll create an equal sign, so there's actually only one side. But then there is there's two sides, and I'm actually going to take a stand on one of them, right? I'm going to see the good in industry. I'm going to see the good in the flower, and I'm going to stand on the side of focusing on the flower, not because I think there's no good on the industry, but because this is the particular subject in which I can engage in mixing metaphor and breaking my imagination. Because you also said something very important. It's not just about being humble, right? Because you can be humble and never apprehend in this way, right? You can be humble, but actually you're being humble saying that industry is bad, flower is good. So there's actually a remarkable judgmentalism in that, right? Because you're saying all of this is bad and this is good and I'm going to be humble before the flower. It brings with it a humility, but actually the moment you bring an equal sign, there's not humility. There's a lack of humility, right? And so there has to be a two-ness and then a commitment. There has to be a bothness and then a choice, which then, of course, is scary. And it's difficult precisely because you can see the good in both sides. So then you could be wrong, but you also acknowledge that for whatever reason, perhaps God has made you and chosen you to do this particular work in this particular way, and you'll take a stand on that, or you'll take a side on that, and so on and so forth. So more to be said on that, but I think that's a very powerful point that you're making. But again, and I'll give it to you, I think it's just so interesting how the senses do apprehend. Like they don't calculate. And if thinking can serve the senses versus replace the senses, then thinking finds its fittedness in apprehension. And then I do think that the senses emerge I think thinking can coordinate the senses to work together. That's kind of the issue. Like you need thinking to coordinate the senses into dance. If you don't have thinking, senses end up atomized or pulling themselves apart. But if you have thinking, you run the risk of replacing the senses or treating thinking as simply the images of senses, and then it gets lost in itself and it's no longer solidified. But let me throw it back at you.
Well said. The thinking serving. I do believe that Christianity is the greatest vehicle for self-discovery because it makes the claim that the human being is created, as well as everything else. But the human being is created. The human being is not a thing in process to something else. It was made, and as Kierkegaard might say, it might forget itself, which means it also might remember what it has forgotten. But it's not where it might think it is, which is to say, well, most of my life most of these decades, I've been outside the house, and I've heard enough music coming through the walls. I've read my newspaper. I've put in my time on the History Channel. There might be something to it. I'll go and see. And yes, come and see. But to pretend to oneself that I am outside and I'll go in and see, and then I'll come out and think about it, and I might go back in, but we will see. Really, the claim seems to me to be God is on our side. Do we want to be healed? Do we want life?
Mm.
And if so, then necessarily we'll have to know what's wrong or what hurts. And then we have to learn to tolerate the medicine, not forever, but for as long as we need it. We don't have to understand the molecular components of the medicine. We just have to know that it's medicine. Who tells us it's medicine? Someone we trust. How do we know that we trust them? Do we step outside our own consciousness and third person look down at ourselves before we take the pill and say, well, do I know what trust is? Am I activating trust as I accept the pill, or am I lying? These pseudo-ethical questions are not real. Trust is a in media res thing. It's in the middle of things. It's not a finished product before it practices. And I think we've been subjugated for so long to close reading practices that we're perfectly comfortable with a haiku and alone time, that we feel as if we're making a world out of that haiku because we're the arbiter of every meaning of those 15 words. But when it gets larger, then either we find two or three people that will agree with us on every dogma, or we accept that a tradition has to mediate it if the body of text is going to grow. So that when I activate my senses and see the words and say them out loud and call it a prayer, a formal prayer that I'm reciting that someone else has penned for me, as I do that, I'm going to have rushes of emotion. I'm going to have clarity. I'm going to be taking the medicine. And also, as I'm doing it, I'm aware of the fact that I'm doing this because my tradition says to do it, without filling in every single hole of why I might ask. And as I know that I'm doing it for that reason, I change for that reason. Whereas if I know that I'm reading a haiku according to close reading practices, and that's all I'm ever going to be able to do, the trick of that is I also know that I'm doing that. And that knowledge will change me. So there are two kinds of knowledges, and both will change a person. It comes down to, what do we want? And maybe we don't know, but as we lean in, we learn more. And then we discover more of what already was there, because indeed we were created. And that's a thing easy to say, like a haiku is quick and easy to say. But when you find out that through and through you are created, and discovering that, the significance of the word discovery and the significance of the word created take on entirely different meanings when they are lived reality.
Mm.
And that and it's hard for me to see how that can be done outside of the open arena that a tradition affords. I mean, it widens things for the body to rise in the ocean. That's really all I have tonight, my dear friend. I have to go in about 10 minutes, but I want you to have the last few words.
Well, you just said, well, and I should as well. I never know where the time goes, and I really appreciate it, Matthew. I think, so there's a few things. There's an interesting way where we've also snuck in the certainty, even in postmodernism or today, where we say, and there's a kind of certainty in certain practices that are responsible to do if there's no certainty. Okay, I'll just do the close reading of the haiku. Oh, I'll be a specialist. I'll kind of stay in a very narrow range. You can be like, that's the responsible thing to do where there is no certainty, and you can be certain that you're being responsible if there is no truth that you can be certain in. So there's a way in which there are various kind of methods you can do to give you the feeling of I'm doing the right thing. I'm doing the right thing. Because ultimately, certainty has something to do with wanting to know that you're doing the right thing. I've done the right thing. Okay, well, if the colleges say I need this sort of reading practice, I need this number of citations, I need this professionalism, I can be certain that I'm doing the right thing. So there's a kind of subtle certainty that comes in that is actually scratching that itch, even as you say, well, there's no truth and certainty is impossible, right? It's actually still lurking there. I think what you're pointing out too on the idea of a tradition, well, the issue is that outside of a tradition, if you're trying to engage in apprehension, there's a way in which there are no boundaries by which that apprehension can work without calculation and not run the risk of just getting lost, right? We've been saying that calculation has some sort of critical role to serve the senses, to serve apprehension, and you need thinking where if the senses are leading you out in apprehension into some sort of Gnostic world or understanding of things, well, then thinking's like, no, come back, you're losing sight of the order, right? I mean, there's another way we can put this in which thinking is trying to maintain the order so that you can apprehend freely and not get lost, right? Because there's always a tension between order and lost, right? Well, tradition has a way of creating a structure in which you could, dare I say, explore apprehension, explore the beautiful, and then know when you're letting beauty become an end in its own right. Because there's always the issue where the good, the true, and the beautiful need all three at all times, right? If you lose one, they all kind of fall apart. Our age is one that tends to lose the beautiful, and you could argue that the beautiful entails the other two, but you always have to have the other two, and the beautiful has to stay in a certain range, if you will, to be apprehended as itself and not be confused as mere pleasantry or symmetry, right? So there's something about a tradition that can have that structure. But there's also something about a tradition that can replace the apprehension with its own structure as being the metric of development, right? And that's always the tension that has to be maintained. And then, of course, if the structure makes this mistake, it probably has simultaneously trained people within that structure by various habits to be unable to see that has occurred, right? Because we're always habituated and trained by the structures we're in, right? So tradition is necessary, just like thinking is necessary, and I associate tradition with thinking and rationality in this example. They're necessary, but they necessarily entail risks of enclosure in that necessity. And that's always what we're dealing with, right? Therefore, it's reasonable that people said, let's not have a tradition. Let's not have philosophy. Let's not have thinking. Well, that's where Hegel's like, but then you're in the naive and intuitionism that will actually end up in its own fragmentation. It will end up in emotional reductionism just as much as you can end up in an intellectual reductionism. Or now there's the reductionism of personality. It's just my personality. It's just what I feel. Everything can be reduced to your personal preference, right? So there are various forms of enclosures that can take in, and you have to go through the gambit so that you don't end up in some reductionism of some kind, right? There are all these different forms that you have to be.
Can I ask you a question?
Please.
On that note, think of the parable of the man who saw his crops manifoldly multiply. They multiplied. They came out of the ground, the left and right, top, center. Even on that mountain over there, it's green. Oh, it hurts my eyes. It's golden. All right. It was a crop of a higher yield this year than ever before. He says to himself, I know what I'll do. Deconstruct the barn, build it twice as big, fill it up with the grain, and then say, soul, take your ease. I have plenty in the barn. At that moment, God says, you fool, your soul is required of you this night. Who's going to receive all that you've put in your barn? My question is, he didn't examine his soul. Would tradition have told him to examine his soul, or would his own conscience have? Vice versa. Did tradition tell him this is an odd year, a miracle year? Deconstruct and build a bigger barn. That's what men do in your situation now. Or, without a tradition, is that what he came up with? I can see the question being beveled either way. Does the tradition tell us to examine the soul, or does the tradition tell us to build a bigger barn? Does my own internal watchfulness over the kingdom of heaven tell me to examine my soul? Or does the tradition that conveys the way to the virtues tell me to examine my soul?
I think it's a tremendous question. It brings me back. So a lot of times, one can almost make a distinction between tradition and canon, tradition and history, because a lot of times now tradition has become the authority, right? But there's an interesting way in which the Bible, let's take the Bible as quote unquote tradition. There's something weird about it because it gives conflicting stories or it's a mixed metaphor. Good traditions have a mixed structure in it, right? Where the man goes to the tradition and there are stories of where someone does build a barn and you read the context, and then there's one where they don't build a barn. The tradition will actually entail a multitude of narratives of different situations that then the consciousness has to, based on that, make a decision on, right? Because to me, like good traditions like I always think about the literary canon, right? Like the literary canon has many voices, and the Bible is a library, right? It has many voices, many different accounts, many different voices. You say, well, that's an error, right? That's a mistake. No, it actually is just like a mixed metaphor. It's actually a feature so that tradition does not become an image, because that's what can occur. Tradition can become an image, but if there's a tradition of everyone who believes in Christianity reading these books and orbiting these stories, orbiting these parables, orbiting this man, then that forms a structure of tradition from an orbiting, not from a top-down, right? And you see that orbiting then, that becomes, that's really important because it gives direction to the conscious without being an either or between the tradition and the conscious, right? And that, I think, is ultimately what's needed, just like it's not an either or between thinking and the senses, right? It's a certain orbiting that occurs in the person between them that requires okay, thinking, I ultimately need to serve the senses, and the senses are like, yeah, we need to ultimately have some sort of ordering by thought. So there's a dance between those things that are going on, right? Like for me, honestly, to say something, I'm not sure if you can have a tradition without the humanities, actually. Like, I think very often we associate tradition with church structure. And I'll even talk about structure. There is a structure, but tradition has almost become a governmental word, a political word, a bureaucratic word. When I'm reading the Bible, and the tradition are the debates, these recounting of the story. Well, this is what the Torah said. This is what the tradition is more indivisible from the humanities, right? Like an act of interpretation, like it's a tradition. It's a hermeneutic tradition, right? But you see, the problem is we think hermeneutics and tradition are opposites. Interpretation is bad. Tradition is the opposite of interpretation, is what the modern mind does, because it's drunk on certainty, right? No, what we see in Jesus is that the tradition is to interpret. That is the tradition. Like, we have a tradition of interpreting this text and this man and figuring out what it means, right? And that actually does create a structure, because if I know all these 20 people all share in the same tradition of interpreting, then even there's diversity, but also similarity. There's many, but there's also one, right? A hermeneutic tradition allows there to be a cultural many in the one, which then doesn't replace consciousness, but it, like the individual decision, but it also creates a backing for the decision, right? And so, like, because the problem is many people have a tradition today called the economy, responsibility. Oh, you know, most people, that's the problem. The problem is that guy in a way is following the tradition. What do you do in the, what's the tradition in the economy when you have a good crop? Well, you store it, right? So the problem isn't a lack of tradition. In a sense, it's the wrong kind of tradition. There's another way in which a tradition is a pattern. What pattern do we follow when this occurs, right? Well, we had a good crop, so the pattern is we build a big barn and we contain it, right? Well, the issue is, the issue is a hermeneutic tradition is one where we observe together the pattern and work to figure out the pattern and how it is unfolding, versus have that hermeneutic effort outsourced to a pre-given pattern that we just follow, right? And that's what I like when tradition becomes bureaucratic and political. Well, what's the pattern here? What do we follow? What do we do? There's no thinking involved. But a hermeneutic tradition, that's only possible because of thinking, and we're actually unified in the shared act of thinking and the shared commitment of apprehending anew because of this orbiting, because of this effort. This is changing how we apprehend, and I know how you apprehend is changing. You know how I apprehend am changing. Everyone around here knows that everyone else, their apprehension is changing, and we are unified in that shared commitment to that transformation of apprehension. And so it doesn't replace the conscious decision. It actually becomes, well, the confidence that the consciousness of all these individuals are many, but they're also one in that hermeneutic tradition. So I don't know if you can have tradition without the humanities. Like, that's one of the problems. We don't really know. We don't teach the humanities like we know what they're for. We're not sure what they're for. We think they're there for fun or entertainment. It's the humanities are kind of how you get a many in the one. It's how you get a diversity that's not chaos. The humanities is precisely civically incredibly important because it allows this interesting category of hermeneutic tradition without which you're in trouble, right? I mean, obviously, when they write the Constitution or Declaration of Independence, there's a similar thing going on. But the problem is that that's been replaced by basically just the judges. A new kind of oligarchy, there's another term. The judges now rule. We ourselves don't do interpretation. We read it and then get our guy in power to force our reading. It's not a cultural shared interpretation that we're working through together and finding unity in that. And to me, that kind of understanding of tradition, because then the last thing I'll say, and I'll run, and I love speaking with you, Matthew, is that then the question is, the kind of notion of almost, I want to say, progress, like spiritual progress. Is it because you're moving up in the tradition? Like, what is the metric, right? There's one way in which I want to say is the more that you actually find rest in that orbiting, rest in that hermeneutic interpretation, more that you actually find yourself comfortable in and working out and looking forward to participating in that tradition, right? Which is as a hermeneutic tradition, which is interesting because then it is saying that progress is found in the tradition, but it's not a quantifiable ascent in the tradition. It's found in maintaining fidelity to the tradition of doing the work of hermeneutics, of doing the work of refining interpretation, and in believing that we're all doing that together, which of course we can associate with dialogos, the liminal web circling, and what people are doing. Because what I do say on the liminal web is a kind of return to hermeneutic tradition. It's a return to a sort of unity that is not based on something outsourced, but is found in each individual participating, being shared in the commitment to the effort of actually figuring things out, not for the sake of like randomness, but because they're observing the same thing and they're trying to get at what it means, but it's mixed. The thing is mixed. Reality is mixed up in all the layers, just like the mixed metaphor. Reality, like when we're talking about the hierarchy of being and upper and lower and emancipate, reality is mixed. Reality is a mixed metaphor per se. So we have to orbit it, and it won't fit neatly into imagination, which can be frustrating and lead to nihilism. But if you have the right tradition, based on a hermeneutic, it's exciting. It's exactly what you should expect it to be. It's mixed up because it's not letting your brain take over. It's forcing you to remember, to move back to thinking, serving the senses, and working toward apprehension as opposed to getting lost in the entropy of calculation. And so the very mixedness of reality is actually a grace that keeps you always working toward the negentropic apprehension that you would forget if reality wasn't mixed, and you wouldn't need other people either, because it is other people that actually help you think thoughts and apprehend things you wouldn't have ever thought before. That is the best way to approach reality as mixed, and in conversation you find yourself apprehending things you never thought before, right? Which is thus training you and habituating you to the reality that is mixed in its very grace, so that you can work toward the negentropic and not the entropic. And I think that enjoyment, that beauty, that habituation to that becomes the progress. Please.
I mean, I could not agree with you more. And one of the things I cherish about our friendship is this shared interpretive intensity. As you said, this hermeneutical back and forth, it does things for me that I can't put into words.
Yes.
And I think of the vineyard. We're in the vineyard. I'm not alone in the vineyard. There are many people in the vineyard. They're working hard, and they're doing different things. And there's you and there's me, and clapping and doing whatever people do in vineyards, and pressing things and getting grape all over us, and a lot of foliage, and it's hot out, and I'm so certain of what I'm doing, and I start to sink down, and you lift me up, and then vice versa, and kind of like shielding each other in the heat of the day. And we make this stuff, and we think we know what it means. And then the king comes, or the son of the king comes. And what's not said in the parable, because they, for some reason, had lost their way and wanted the vineyard. And so the first thing they saw when they saw the son was an opportunity to kill him. Instead, we let the king in. We're so excited to give him our product, which is his anyway. It's his vineyard, but we made the wine. We grew the grape, we broke it, we tried different things, mixtures. We had arguments. We also, in our mixing of the metaphor, mixing of the grapes, mixing of the barrels, mixing of the ratios, we're mixing ourselves into it with each other. Sometimes I don't know where your apprehension begins and my close study of the haiku ends. And then we give him this. Does he try it and then give us his opinion? Does he roll up his sleeves and start, you missed this thing right here. It was right in front of your eyes. And then we see it as if for the first time. And then we find ourselves interacting with him and mixing. That, to me, is the face of hermeneutics that doesn't burn things away. And I enjoy doing it with you.
And I enjoy doing it with you. And that metaphor, everything that you described is discovered, not created. But it is discovered because it was created by the creator. You mentioned that as well. Like, we are created as human beings. This is what's interesting. God created that which we discover, but we tend to not discover it because we confuse it with our own creations, right? Like, but the funny thing is that that's not because our own creations are bad, but because we're supposed to create our own creations out of what is discovered to then give to the Lord, right? Like, our creations are supposed to be out of the material of what is discovered, not what we create. So it has to be like a vineyard is a wonderful metaphor. And basically that metaphor, that scene you just painted, that to me is that is apprehension. That is the role of apprehension. That is the highest form of thought. Because you also said these conversations do something on me that I cannot put into words. That's it. That's exactly it. That's the whole body developing, not just the mind. That's the whole person is developing. That requires the humanities, because it requires the act of tearing with interpretation, right? It requires, and the humanities are the field of learning interpretation. You do not learn pure interpretation basically in the sciences. Yes, you interpret the data, but there's data to interpret. In the humanities, you're saying, does this work? Does this work? I read this book. Does this work? And what is the thing we're trying to make it work through? Well, we have these lived experience. Well, I can't remember. No, I remember. You're trying to remember the very thing that then you're pulling out the data to frame, and you're creating it, and like you're in the vineyard, and hey, and you want to share it, right? That is unique to the humanity. That possibility is unique to the humanities. Now, the sciences are the ones that helped you like build the barn and have the vineyard. That's really important. But once you have the vineyard, if you just keep building barns, if you don't ever do the humanities work, then you never move into thinking, serving senses. You never move into this realm of apprehension that you're doing. Because what's weird, apprehension is when you're working in the vineyard, you have this moment like, hey, you apprehend when it's done. You apprehend when you offer it, right? And you apprehend when the Lord shows up, right? There is this, oh, hey, kind of moment. And that is.
What do you think?
Yeah.
What do you think?
What do you think?
What do you think?
And
we're not asking him to give us a diatribe. We're asking him to taste.
You're asking him to taste.
And then, what do you think?
Yeah, you're not asking for calculation. You're asking apprehend. What do you think? What do you think? That is the fullness.
And it's funny because if I were to ask him that, what am I even asking him? I don't know.
Exactly.
But it's the best I can do in wanting him to participate, because I'm participating in this to participate him into this participation, as it were.
I mean, that's a beautiful question, because how does this taste? You wouldn't ask that if you didn't sense that it's about right. It's in the range of what you want, but you also don't know what you're asking. And that is where thought finds itself. That is non-reductionist, because you can't reduce what you've made to not the knowledge of the taste, but it's also contingent on something beyond you, right? That is
in the ocean to the wine cup. We did it, full circle.
Well, and it's beautiful, and it's like, how does it taste? You don't know, but you also know it's right to ask, how does it taste? That's what's interesting. You have a certain confidence, that it's right to ask now, how does it taste? But that very question is a testament that you don't know how it tastes, and you need to offer it, right? And then it is given back to you. But it can't be given back to you until you give it forward first, right? You have to offer it, and you're offering a kind of experimentation. And yet the experimentation is not random, right? It is also a sort of sense of, this is right, this is what we need to do. Okay, what do you think? Okay, it goes back and forth, and how does it taste? How does it taste? I think that's a beautiful question. I think that's exactly that's where thought finds itself. That's where the human finds itself, and that's where one avoids the pitfalls of sly and cunning reductionisms that we're not aware are there. Matthew Allison, it is always a treat to speak with you, my friend. I look forward to these conversations. Thank you, sir.
Bye-bye. Have a good night.
Bye now. All the best to you.